Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Mental Health Mondays. We are with our community partner again, and today's presenter is Cynthia, and she will be talking about managing stress. So, without further ado, Cynthia, take us away.
Hey, thank you. So my name is Cynthia Hernandez. I am a pre-licensed clinician at the Institute on Violence, Abuse, and Trauma. And I will be talking to you guys all about managing stress. As we're starting this new year, it's pretty inevitable that we're going to be experiencing stress, right? And so it's good to start thinking about how we deal with that stress and how we can manage that stress in a healthier way. Okay, so what I hope that we all learn today is being able to define what stress is, identify some common stressors that not only everyone experiences, but specifically what you experience, and then understand what those negative impacts of stress are, talking quickly about vicarious trauma, and then identifying and finding new stress management self-care strategies that we would want to implement into our lives. And so starting out with what is stress? So stress is something that we all tend to experience, but wondering if we all know what that means, right? And so stress is a state of worry or mental tension that's caused by a difficult situation. And so it's really our human response that prompts us to address the challenging and sometimes threatening events in our lives. And so it's our body's response to any type of physical or mental demand or pressure that we place on it. And so an example of the way that our body responds physically to stress is through the chemical response of adrenaline. And so adrenaline is released as a response to some of the stress that we might experience. And this might lead to some behaviors that we often think of as like fight, flight, or freeze. When we think about fight, flight, or freeze, oftentimes we think about it in like very dangerous situations, right? Like a car accident or something like that. But this can also happen in events that are happening in our day-to-day life. So think about situations where you're overly stressed and maybe you become angry or very irritable or frustrated, right? That's an example of your adrenaline response coming through. Or maybe things become so stressful that you don't even want to work on the things that you're supposed to work on, right? Things that we talk about like procrastination or putting things off. Sometimes that's an example of like the freeze or fight response. So these are some of the examples of how stress might show up in our bodies. And so is all stress bad, right? And I think this is an important question to ask because I think when we think about stress, we're only thinking about the negative ways that stress comes up in our daily lives, but stress isn't always a bad thing. It really depends on the situation, how we perceive that situation, and how that situation is then handled. And so we can think of stress as a spectrum, right? Think of a line and a spectrum. You're either too overly stressed or there's not enough stress happening. And so when we're on the other side of the spectrum where there's too little stress, it can lead to boredom, right? We're not too interested in the topic or the thing that's happening. It's not challenging enough to motivate us to want to do the thing. Think about kids who are in school and maybe they already know the subject at hand, or you're in a meeting and you already know what the meeting is about. It's a meeting that could have been in an email, right? And so you're not motivated to pay attention or to be in the room or to be challenged enough to do the work. Now, if you're too stressed, that can lead to too much anxiety, too many feelings of being overwhelmed, which can then lead to no productivity. And so what we really want is this healthy balance of something that is challenging enough for us to be interested in it and also interesting enough to want to be motivated to do it, but not too overwhelming where it suddenly paralyzes us to not want to complete the task, right? So this moderate level of stress can really improve our efficiency in a variety of different areas of our life, not just work or school, but also in our home life. And so when we talk about stress, again, there are different types of stress. Now, good stress or eustress is actually a topic that I wasn't even aware of before, thinking about this topic of managing stress. And so it was also a learning point for me, right? So good stress or eustress refers to stress that comes from the demand of pleasant or fun activities. And so we might find it, again, interesting and motivating enough for us to want to do it. It's still challenging and it still causes stress, but it's still this good stress where it's from a pleasant or fun activity. So think about a vacation, right? There's so much that goes into planning for a vacation. Where are we going? Where are we staying? How long are their flights? Or if we're taking a road trip, how long is that going to be? What stops are we making? How many of us are going? Who's paying for it? How are we paying for it? What activities are we, right? That's so many things that we need to do. But because it's a pleasant and fun activity, sometimes the steps that it takes to do it can be very interesting and fun and motivating, stressful, but good, right? Same thing for a wedding. So many things that come into play when it comes to a wedding. Finding a flower vendor, where are we going to be having, what's the venue? Who's invited? Who's not invited, right? Are we having kids? Are we uh, going to be doing this as a small wedding or a big wedding, right? So all of these different things that go into planning a wedding can also be very stressful, but at the end produce a very fun, hopefully fun and pleasant activity, right? Fun event. Sports, same thing. It can be very stressful to practice and get ready for a sport event, but it's still something really fun and exciting that we like to do. Other extracurricular activities, think about like bands or theater or anything like that. Other events they want to go to, like concerts or other social events, right? These are things that can be stressful to plan for or create a lot of demand on us, but they're still fun and pleasant. Now, there's bad stress, which I think a lot of us are very familiar with, right? This feeling of distress. And so this is stress that comes from negative demands that we have to adapt to. Now, we still have to adapt to stress that comes from good stress, but sometimes it can feel overwhelming to have to adapt and change our schedules or our lifestyle or the way that we handle a situation when it comes to distress. And the other example when it comes to bad stress, or the other part of bad stress, is that it can happen when we have stress for too much time, right? It's not just that one day at work is stressful or one day at home is stressful or 2 or 3 days. No, it's happening for a longer period of time and we're not experiencing this sort of break. And so examples of distress is like when students have to cram for finals, right? Finals week is very common when it comes to college. And so it's like a week or two of projects and essays and presentations and exams all in one week for various classes. That can be very stressful, right? Or too heavy of a workload at work. Or even a troubled relationship, right? If it's not just, oh, we had an argument one day, but we are having arguments every single day for weeks on end, that's a troubled relationship that can cause a lot of stress for too much time. And so common stressors. And so it's important to identify what stressors you are experiencing, right? And so as I go through this list, I want you to ask yourself, what are some of the things that make you stressed out? Are there certain categories that stress you out more than others? And which of these categories give you eustress, right? Or that good stress? And which of these categories give you distress or that bad stress? And thinking about what are the things that give you more anxiety or feelings of overwhelmed versus things that make you more excited and motivated to do things. So common stressors, I think the first two are the ones that are most identifiable for people, right? So school can be very stressful. Again, like I talked about, the finals week, right? Or maybe there's a really difficult class that's making you very stressed because maybe you're not really understanding the material, or maybe you need extra supports and you're not receiving those supports, right? That can cause someone to be very stressed out. And just general, not just having to go to school for 8 hours, but then on top of that, having to do homework for another, 2, 3, 4 hours, depending on what classes you're taking. Now, work also very, very stressful. I think that's probably one of the most common stressors, right? Is work. Having to adapt your life. If you don't have strong boundaries in the workplace, sometimes you aren't just working for those 8 hours, but sometimes you work beyond those 8 hours. If you're not receiving enough compensation for the work that you're doing, that can be very stressful. Maybe you have coworkers who aren't doing the same amount of work that you're doing, but they're receiving the same compensation, or they're receiving a lot more praise than you're receiving. Maybe you have a contentious relationship with your boss. That can be very stressful, right? Creating a very stressful, unhealthy, uncomfortable work environment. That can be very stressful. If you're a teacher and you have students that aren't listening to you and administration isn't supporting you, that can be very stressful. If you're a doctor or a therapist or someone who works in the field, working person to person, it can be stressful having to interact with individuals and having to experience their trauma and, the things that they're experiencing in their lives, or talking about the things that they've experienced in their lives. And so again, work can be stressful for a variety of different reasons. Now, family can be very stressful, right? If you're a parent, having to navigate your children's schedules, right? Not just school, but then after school activities or their friendships, having to navigate all the things that they're going through. If they're teenagers, navigating hormones and changes and all of that. Partners, right? Having to navigate another person's emotions. Other family members, parents, mother-in-laws, father-in-laws, having to deal with their expectations of you or your expectations of them, right? Sisters, cousins, everyone has expectations of us. And so all of that can be very stressful. Having to make sure that people in your life are, I don't want to use the word comfortable, but kind of comfortable, right? That you're sort of in a good relationship with them, that can be very stressful, especially if you're appeasing a lot of people and not necessarily paying attention to what you're feeling. And then other relationships, right? I talked about partners in like a marriage situation, but other relationships like friendships, romantic relationships could be included in that. And so those can be very stressful as well. Same thing as I mentioned when it came to the family, just everyone having their own expectations for one another, expectations about communication, when we're supposed to hang out, things like that. Finances also a very common stressor, right? In this day and age with the cost of living coming up, it's very stressful, managing bills, taxes are coming up, making sure we have our taxes, all of our tax paperwork together and ready can be very stressful. Making sure that every single bill is paid on time can be very stressful. The way that work and finances also come together as sort of like a layered stressor, right? If your work isn't paying you enough to cover your finances, that can be extremely stressful, especially if you're not able to find a job that is able to pay you more. Health and illness, when I think of this stressor, I think of it in sort of two ways. So one is where, you're going to the doctor and you know that there's something wrong, right? You have some sort of diagnosis or some sort of diagnosed health issue. That alone is stressful, knowing that you have this and how to navigate it, right? And then there's also the other part where you're having the symptoms, but you don't necessarily know what's wrong. And either you're not able to go to the doctor because of health insurance, issues, or because maybe there's a fear of going to the doctor, right? For whatever reason, maybe the last time that you went to the doctor, it wasn't a good experience, or maybe you're just scared of what might be wrong, right? So all of that can cause a lot of stress. Living situation, if you are living in a place that you don't necessarily want to live in, right? Maybe you're living in a small location, small house, small apartment with a lot of other people and you don't want to live there anymore. Maybe you're living by yourself and you feel very lonely and you don't want to live by yourself anymore, right? So the living situation. And then environment, right? Let's say you're living in a place where there's constantly construction, it's keeping you up at night, or it's waking you up earlier than you want to, or it's causing so much traffic every single day that you're coming home from work, or whatever the case may be. Just the environment itself is a place that you don't want to be in anymore. That can cause a lot of stress as well. So hopefully through this, you guys were able to identify some of the stressors that you guys are experiencing. And so with that, kind of identifying some of the negative effects of high stress. Now, this is in no way an all-encompassing list, right? There are also a variety of other ways that stress can impact you in a negative way, but this is just some. And so something to remember here is that because our bodies are in a high state of stress, we're, in this state of fight, flight, or freeze, it's reserving our energy for other things. And so when we think about the physical effects of high stress, think about how our body's reserving energy for other things. So weight gain, right? We're in this high level of stress. It's our body's reserving energy. And so we're not burning calories. And so we might be gaining weight. The other end of it, though, is that we might also be losing weight because we're not eating, right? Because we're too stressed out, or we don't have enough time because work is just so stressful, or school's so stressful, and so we're not eating. And so we might be losing weight in a way that we're not actively trying to lose weight. Lower immune functioning, right? Our body, again, is reserving energy, and so we're not able to fight off viruses or diseases as easily. Experiencing higher blood pressure, higher cholesterol, higher risk for heart disease and stroke, experiencing hair loss, and then difficulty sleeping. The other part of having high stress is that sometimes it leads us to unhealthy coping strategies, which we'll discuss a little bit more later. And then in the fields of sort of education and even in work, right? High stress can interfere with our learning, with our memory, and it can cause a distraction. And so we're not really focused on the material at hand. And so that can lead us to, again, like the procrastination, difficulty retaining information, difficulty completing tasks. And then in the emotional realm, or the emotional effects of high stress, is that it can cause anxiety, cause mood swings, things like depression and angry outbursts. And this next slide is just like another visual and more symptoms or more effects of high stress. So in the body, things like fatigue, headaches, skin irritations, frequent infections, breathlessness, tight muscles, muscle twitches. When we think about our emotions, things like increased irritability, depression, loss of confidence, maybe you're more fussy, more apprehensive, alienation, so isolating yourself from other people and being more apathetic. In your mind, so more worrying, more hasty decision-making, impaired judgment, muddled thinking, experiencing nightmares, being more negative and being indecisive. And then in terms of our behaviors, things like insomnia, if you're more accident prone, having things like loss of appetite, loss of sex drive, drinking more, smoking more, and then experiencing restlessness. And so this brings me to this topic of vicarious trauma. So what can happen when we are working professionally with those who have experienced trauma, especially when we are trying to manage our own trauma and stressors at the same time? So when that happens, it sort of refers to, or it leads to this vicarious trauma. And this vicarious trauma refers to traumatization of the helper, right? So think of the helper as someone like, again, like a teacher, a therapist, a doctor, someone who's working in the church, or a social worker, right? Anyone who works in sort of this helping role with other individuals, firefighters, police officers, right? And so that leads to this process of change resulting from empathetic engagement with trauma survivors. And so it really describes this shift that workers experience in their own worldview when the clients that they work with have experienced trauma. They're sort of discussing this trauma. And so their fundamental beliefs about the world are altered and possibly damaged by being repeatedly exposed to this traumatic material. And so vicarious trauma is a negative reaction of trauma exposure and includes a range of psychosocial symptoms. And so a lot of the negative effects that we talked about in terms of stress are similar to the negative effects of vicarious trauma, but might be a little bit more intensified. And so this vicarious trauma can cause an immense amount of stress on the individual as well. And so this brings me to talking about some of the common signs of vicarious trauma. And so if you find yourself experiencing some of these signs or these symptoms of vicarious trauma, you may be experiencing this vicarious trauma, especially if you work in the fields where you're encountering people who are experiencing and sharing their trauma with you. Again, people like teachers. I know this isn't something that necessarily comes to mind a lot, but teachers are often at the forefront of teenagers or children sort of disclosing some of their trauma, right? And so they also experience this vicarious trauma. People like doctors, people like nurses, people like therapists and psychologists and psychiatrists, social workers, again, people who work in the church, right? All of these people might be vulnerable to experiencing vicarious trauma. And some of these signs, again, are things like lingering feelings of anger, rage, and sadness about a patient's victimization. And I use patient very sort of loosely, right? It doesn't have to be a patient, it can just be a person, right? Overly involved emotionally with the individual, experiencing something like bystander guilt or shame, feelings of doubt, right? Am I supposed to be in this field? I'm not even helping anyone. Everyone I encounter is experiencing trauma. Preoccupation with thoughts of the person outside of the work situation, right? You're not just thinking about them through that 8-hour work shift. You're at home thinking about them while you're making dinner or at the grocery store or out with friends or running some errands, right? It's in the back of your mind or even at the forefront of your mind. Over identification with the patient, right? Having horror or rescue fantasies. Having this loss of hope, pessimism, and cynicism, distancing, numbing, detachment, cutting patients off, staying busy, avoiding listening to people's stories of traumatic experiences, right? You don't want to feel that sort of weight of someone else's trauma story. And so you're starting to avoid other people because of that. And then difficulty maintaining professional boundaries with the client, such as overextending yourself, trying to do more than is in the role to help the person. So, again, if you're a doctor or a therapist or a social worker, giving someone your personal number instead of the office phone number, or trying to help them with other things that isn't necessarily in your job role. So these are examples of some signs of vicarious trauma. And you'll see that as we talk about stress management and self-care, you'll see that a lot of the feelings or thoughts or behaviors related to vicarious trauma can be relieved by some of these stress management strategies. And so what are some of the negative ways that people deal with stress, right? We'll talk, of course, about more positive ways, but first we need to identify some of these negative ways because maybe we're engaging in some of these things and we don't even realize that these are one, stress management strategies that we're trying to do, or, these behaviors that we're trying to use to cope with some of this stress. And two, that they're negative, right? Some of these things might not seem like a negative way to deal with stress right off the bat, but as we talk about it a little bit more, we'll start to realize like maybe that's not the most healthiest way to deal with my stress. So using substances, right? Some people will use substances like drugs or alcohol as a way to deal with their stress. Sometimes they think that it's not, that bad, or that I'm just doing it to sort of relieve some of the stress a little bit. But oftentimes we can build a dependence on these substances, right? People will sometimes use these substances as a way to sort of numb the behavior or numb the feeling that we're having or the thoughts that we're having related to this stress or vicarious trauma. But if we're not dealing with the stress itself, then the stress is going to continue and we're going to continue to use the substances, right? Overeating is another example of a negative way to deal with stress. Sometimes this is because we're so stressed out, we're so on autopilot, right? We're sometimes not being mindful of what we're eating. So I'm just gonna grab that big old family-sized bag of chips and Doritos, and I'm just gonna eat it while I'm watching TV because I'm just mindlessly eating. I just want to turn my brain off. I'm not actually dealing with the stress at hand or the stress that's weighing on my body. And now I just finished a whole family-sized bag of Doritos by myself, right? And now that's a little bit of an over exaggeration, but sometimes when we're not paying attention to what's happening within our body, we overdo things, right? And sometimes the other end of it, as I mentioned earlier, is under eating, right? Skipping a few meals because I just don't have the time. I'm just so stressed out. There's just so many things that I need to do that eating is at the bottom of my priority list, right? And so again, our eating habits, right? Not following a healthy sort of, not diet, but healthy schedule of eating can result in a negative way, or can be a negative way of dealing with our stress. Caffeine as well, right? Again, I think this is something that not a lot of people would think is that negative, but it can be, especially if we're drinking 2, 3, 4 cups of coffee a day, or not just coffee, but energy drinks, right? And that's not healthy for our body. Avoiding the stress altogether, right? I'm just not going to think about it. I'm not going to do anything about it. It doesn't turn off the stress. That stress is still in the back of your mind. You're still thinking about it. You think that you're not thinking about it, but you are, right? Even if it's subconsciously. And the thing at hand, the task at hand that needs to be handled is not being handled. And so the stress remains. And then negative self-talk. I think this is one that a lot of people engage in, and sometimes we engage in it very subconsciously. But thinking about how we talk about ourselves, how we think that we talk about ourselves, right? If we think that we're, I have 1,000 things to do, I don't have the time, I didn't finish everything on my task list, I must be so lazy. My coworker, she's able to do all the things that I'm not able to do. She's much more efficient than I am. There must be something wrong with me, right? All of these different ways that we talk about ourselves rather than giving ourselves grace, right? And so really allowing ourselves to give ourselves some of that grace. I won't talk about how to sort of reverse that just yet, because again, we're going to be talking about more positive ways to deal with that stress. And then becoming aggressive, especially with other people, right? Again, that anger, that frustration, that irritability that comes with stress. So sometimes we tend to become overly aggressive with other people, overly impatient with other people, right? And so because our levels of stress are really high, it decreases our ability to be patient with other people. So that's what we call sort of our frustration tolerance, right? When we're stressed out, our frustration tolerance isn't very high. Now, when we're able to sort of cope and strategize and manage our stress, our frustration levels are more manageable. And so we have a better ability to be able to be patient with other people. Then avoiding people, right? You're so stressed, you know that you're going to be irritable with other people. So you know what, I'm just going to avoid my friends altogether. I'm not going to talk to them, I'm not going to hang out with them because I'm just so frustrated. I'm so stressed out, right? That's not healthy either. We begin to isolate ourselves and withdraw from other people when oftentimes other people can really help to relieve some of that stress and also provide a bit of a reminder of the happy things that are, or the positive things that are happening in our lives. And can also serve as a reminder of why we're doing some of the things that we're doing, right? Rather than isolating ourselves from our family or our friends or our kids, right? So avoiding people can often be a negative way to deal with our stress. And so now talking about some of the positive ways that we can deal with stress, right? Again, just like the symptoms or the negative effects of stress, this is not an all-encompassing list of things that we can do to deal with stress. But it is sort of like a start of a list, right? So things like deep breathing, meditation, and yoga, these are things that can really keep us grounded and keep us present in where we are at in that moment, right? I'm not just thinking about all the 20 things that I need to do this next week. Instead, I'm thinking about, okay, right now, in this present moment, how am I? Where am I in my body? How is my body feeling right now? Where's the tension that I'm holding in my body? And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Exercise, right? Exercise is a really sort of popular way that people deal with their stress. Sometimes people think of it as more like cathartic. People exercise for a variety of different reasons, right? For some people, it might be looks. For some people, it might just be about health. For some people, it's just, I want this hour to myself to be able to do something physical. And so exercise can be a really positive way to deal with stress. Listening to music, right? Any music that you like, something that makes you happy, something that makes you feel whatever emotion that it is that you want to feel in that moment. So listening to music, playing with your pets, right? This sort of a very positive outlet when it comes to your stress. Taking a break, I think this is one that I would definitely recommend to everyone to start to implement in their life. I think it's very easy to forget to take our breaks, right? Not even just the breaks that are sort of legally mandated, right? But just breaks in general, not just in work, not just in school, but in life, right? Outside of work, in the home environment, being able to take a break, some time for you. Talking with your family and friends. You don't necessarily have to talk about just the things that are stressful in your life. You can talk about anything else that's happening, right? Talk about, the Super Bowl that just happened, or talk about, something that makes you happy, a new show that you're watching, or a movie that you want to watch in the future. It doesn't have to just be about the stressful things, but you can talk about the things that are stressing you out, right? That can help to sometimes relieve some of the things that you're just holding inside. Creative activities, right? Things like painting or drawing or photography or embroidery or sewing or whatever the case may be, scrapbooking, junk journaling, right? Being able to engage in these activities that are very sort of releasing when it comes to your like creative juices, right? Getting enough sleep. Again, I think this is something that a lot of people don't engage in enough, is really getting your full 8 hours of sleep, allowing yourself, giving yourself permission to take those full 8 hours of sleep, right? And then counseling. So I am a therapist, right? And so I will always recommend counseling to anyone. Gives you a safe space to talk about anything that you want to talk about, right? And really help you to achieve some of your goals. And have a third party person that you can talk to that won't have any sort of judgment towards you. So again, recommending counseling, of course. So what is self-care, right? So self-care is the practice of taking action to preserve or improve one's health. These are actions that we do to help manage our stress, our life challenges, and to counteract and fight against burnout. It's a routine or a lifestyle. And so I think the thing that's very important to know about self-care is that it's any deliberate action that we take in order to take care of our well-being. So again, the deliberate taking action, right? Deliberately doing that. So it's on purpose. It's not just like, oh, well, I mean, yesterday I did get, you know, a frappuccino. And so I guess I can consider that my self-care task, right? No, because you weren't deliberately trying to sort of take care of yourself. And so something to keep in mind again is that this is something that you have to actively try to implement into your life. It's not just that it's something that you casually implement. And that doesn't mean that it has to be extra work, right? This is something that you want to do to take care of yourself, and that's going to help relieve stress. It's not supposed to be something that's even more stressful. And so if you go online, you'll see that some sites have sort of like different numbers of self-care or types of self-care. So some will say 8, some will say 4, some will say more, right? And so I'm going to be talking about the 6 types of self-care that I've noted. And so just keeping that in mind, right? There can be other areas of your life that you want to engage in self-care, or like that maybe might not fall directly into one of these levels of safe or types of self-care, but just keeping that in mind. And as I go through this list, I want you to think about what are the self-care tasks that you do engage in right now, right? So maybe you engage in physical types of self-care a lot more than you engage in maybe psychological types of self-care. And I want you to think about, is it possible that you do really well at engaging in physical types of self-care, but maybe you want to engage more in emotional types of self-care because you're starting to realize, like, I'm actually really stressed out and I feel it more emotionally than I am feeling it physically. And so maybe I want to implement these emotional self-care tasks a little bit more. And so just keeping all of that in mind, right? Again, taking note of what your self-care tasks look like, if you're engaging in self-care tasks at all, and then which are the ones that maybe you want to implement a little bit more. Right. And so starting with these first 2, so physical types of self-care, what are some things that we can engage in? Eating healthy. Now, eating healthy doesn't necessarily mean changing your diet completely or only eating vegetables and fruits, right? Instead, I want you to think about this as a way of incorporating healthier foods into your already established diet, right? So I'm someone who tends to eat mostly just like meat and carbs, right? And so instead of just eating meat and carbs, I'm just going to start incorporating some more, vegetables, broccoli, cauliflower, carrots. Those are my favorite vegetables. So, incorporating that a little bit more in my diet rather than trying to cut out carbs entirely, right? Being a little bit more realistic with those. Moving, dancing, exercising, right? Those are all physical types of self-care as well. Even gardening can be considered a physical type of self-care, or any other type of physical movement, right? Maybe engaging in like a dance class or going biking, right? Or maybe riding a horse. And then things like sleep, right? Again, sleeping 8 hours a day is a way of taking care of yourself. Taking naps sometimes is really important too in the middle of the day, especially if you're really exhausted and you need that, right? Doesn't mean you have to take a 3-hour nap, but maybe a quick 20-minute power nap will be good. And then checking in with yourself, right? Engaging in some mindfulness tasks. And I have at the end of this presentation some resources for some apps that you can use to help with that. Then emotional types of self-care, practicing acceptance and forgiveness. Now, this is something that I don't think a lot of people think about, but really that emotional type of self-care of accepting people for who they are, accepting yourself for who you are, forgiving others instead of holding on to some of that like resentment or anger or frustration. Because oftentimes those feelings can also stress ourselves out. Accepting compliments, right? When someone else compliments you, don't just negate what they're saying or say, no, that's not true, right? I'm not a hard worker. I'm not a great person. No, really try to accept that and realize that you are a great person. You are a hard worker, right? And on top of that, starting to compliment yourself, right? Starting to notice where it is that you're doing good. What are the positive things, not just talking negatively about yourself. And really recognizing where your strengths lie. Engaging in relaxation techniques. Again, I have some resources at the end that will help with some of these relaxation strategies. But examples of this are things like breathing techniques, right? Deep breathing, diaphragmatic breathing, things like progressive muscle relaxation, body scanning, things like that. And then changing our expectations for ourselves, but also changing our expectations for other people, right? If I think that, someone is going to be able to drop everything and come to my beck and call, right? I'm going to be greatly disappointed when they're not able to do that. And I need to be a little bit more realistic with their ability to do that, right? People have lives, people have jobs, people have families. And so maybe not necessarily that they have to drop everything and come to me, but hey, you know what? I really need some help. Do you mind, hearing me out whenever you're available? And most likely that person will be able to reach out when they're available. Then again, changing our own expectations for ourselves. I'm not going to expect myself to be able to complete a big project in one day. Instead, recognizing, okay, what's realistic for me, right? Being a little bit more realistic in our expectations of ourselves and of other people. Another type of self-care is psychological self-care. So things like paying attention to your inner thoughts, feelings, and attitudes. Again, I think this is something that a lot of people don't necessarily engage in, mainly because of our sort of fast-paced lifestyle, right? We're not really stopping and really listening to what's happening inside. And sometimes that can really tell us what it is that we need right now. Then asking and accepting help. I think this one is also very difficult for people, especially when it comes to like a cultural standpoint, right? I'm someone who's Mexican American, and I think it's very common for us to not want to stop and ask someone for help. It's sort of this stigma or this sort of connotation that if you ask someone for help, then you're weak, right? You're not able to do it yourself. And to be honest, sometimes we're not able to do it by ourselves, but that doesn't mean that we're weak or we're not capable. And accepting that help can really relieve a lot of the stress when something doesn't have to all weigh on us, right? Someone else can come and take some of that stress off of us, right? Really, especially when we think of it from like a community standpoint, right? A communal standpoint, that can relieve a lot of that stress that comes on from taking on tasks all by yourself. And then engaging in other things that aren't work or school related. Again, it shouldn't be just you going from home to work to home, from home to school to home, right? Engage in things outside of the home. Sometimes that's, engaging with your friends, engaging with your family. Maybe you want to start taking up a class of some sort, not sort of like a school class, but maybe like, again, like a dancing class or a ceramics class or a photography class, something that you're really interested in. That can be really helpful in relieving some of that stress and really taking care of yourself. I'm just gonna take a little bit of water. Another example of psychological self-care, counseling, right? Of course, I'm going to again promote counseling. Working with someone who's a third party and who's there to support you and help you reach your goals, and provide you that safe space. Talking to friends and family, I'll add to that. Again, doesn't necessarily have to be you talking about stress. It could be talking about other things, but again, you can talk about the things that are stressing you out and sort of get someone else's perspective on it. And then setting some me time, right? Some time where you're able to sort of take care of yourself and really start engaging in these tasks. Spiritual self-care, an example of that is like identifying what is important to you, right? What are the things that motivate you and that you value and that you want to prioritize? Engaging in things like meditation, yoga, reading, practicing your faith, right? Engaging with faith-based leaders or faith-based groups like youth groups or Bible study or other types of activities and groups that are happening in your faith-based organization. And then personal and interpersonal types of self-care, examples of this is like really making a plan for yourself, right? Helping yourself see what it is that you need to do, and rather than sort of like winging it and not knowing where exactly your direction is on this task. Learning something new can be an example of self-care. I'm going to use the example of ceramics because that's something that I really want to learn how to do. But like ceramics, pottery, right? Engaging in something new can, again, be part of that eustress. It's a stressful thing, right? Learning something new, but it can be positive because it's fun and entertaining and informative and motivating, right? Engaging your creative side. So again, photography, drawing, painting, music, right? Things like that. And then nurturing your social connections. So the ways in which you can nurture social connections can be talking with your friends and your family, but also meeting new people, right? There's social events happening in the area, going to those social events, meeting new people, and then going out, right? Whatever that means to you, going to a park, going out with friends on a night out, going to the movies, whatever the case may be. And then professional types of self-care. So I think this one will be important, especially for those who really feel a strong sense of stress in the workplace, right? So setting boundaries, as I mentioned earlier, I did a previous presentation on boundaries before for Mental Health Mondays. And so if you want to take a look at that, that might be helpful too. But just to give a brief one or an example of one is like, for me, a boundary that I have is that I'm not going to answer emails outside of my work hours, right? So if I'm working from 9 to 5, I'm only answering emails from then. And then after work, right after 5 p.m., I'm no longer answering those emails because that time is set aside for my family, for my friends, for my own self-care, right? Taking breaks, again, I think is really important, especially if you're in an environment where you're working with other people socially. As I mentioned before, this sort of phrase of empathically engaging with others. So if you're a doctor, if you're a nurse, teacher, social worker, church leader, or a therapist, right? Taking those breaks in between when you see people, and using that break to engage in something that doesn't have to do with the trauma that has been talked about. Prioritizing tasks, right? And this looks different for other people. So I like to complete tasks based on how challenging or big they are. So I want to complete the hardest tasks first. That way later on, I can sort of breeze through the other things. But some people might want to do the least challenging task first because it's going to be the fastest way to get everything done, right? And so whichever way that looks for you, but prioritizing that. Maybe deadlines is the best way to sort of prioritize things. But again, dependent on you. Breaking tasks down to parts. So breaking things down into smaller parts so that it's easier to complete that task. It's not just, I had to complete a 10-page paper in 2 weeks. I'm not going to try to complete the 10-page paper from one day to the next. No, I'm going to first do the introduction on the first day, and then maybe the next page the next day. And then maybe, 2 days from now, I'll do another page of work, right? So breaking it down into smaller pieces. Then setting realistic goals for yourself, avoiding procrastination, and then in the workplace especially, right, consulting with other people, engaging in your supervision meetings, talking to your boss about what exactly is difficult or challenging in the workplace. And really quickly, so some things about remembering to prioritize your self-care. So trying to set a goal for yourself, right? Again, we don't want this to be another challenging task for you. We want it to be pretty, exciting for you to engage in a self-care task. So making a note to yourself, okay, I want to engage in a self-care task 2 days a week, right? Make a plan for that. Okay, I'm going to do it Tuesdays and Thursdays. Then write it down, maybe put it in your calendar. Tuesdays after work, I'm going to engage in self-care. Thursday after work, I'm going to engage in self-care. And then reward actions, not results, right? So let's say maybe you're not able to engage in that self-care task on Tuesday, but you planned for it, you tried to do it, but you weren't able to do it for whatever reason. You're still rewarding yourself, you're still allowing yourself the ability to engage in that self-care task eventually, right? And then turning bad days into good data. So again, not able to engage in a self-care task on Tuesday. Why not? What was the reason for that? Not that you're punishing yourself, right? But what was the reason for that? Maybe it's because, oh, my daughter has cheerleading on Tuesday afternoons. And so I wasn't able to because I had to take her to cheerleading and then I had to stay there with her. And then afterwards, it was just too late to engage in that self-care task. Okay, so good data for us to know. Maybe Tuesdays aren't the best day to try to engage in self-care tasks. Maybe I'll change it to Monday instead or Wednesday, right? And so using that information and letting us know, not that, you did bad for not engaging in a self-care task, but then what does that mean, right? What can I do instead? And then lastly, here are some stress management and self-care resources that I talked about earlier. So progressive muscle relaxation really quickly is a guided meditation for you to be able to sort of be more present and really recognize what's happening in your body. And so you can find progressive muscle relaxation videos online on YouTube, and they can range from different lengths of time, right? Some can be as short as like 5-6 minutes to as long as like 20 or 30 minutes. So really depending on the time, I don't want you to think, oh, it's 30 minutes, never mind, I'm not going to do that one. You can think that, right? But maybe recognizing it doesn't have to be that long. You can find one that's shorter. Breathe to Relax is an app that gives instructions and exercises in diaphragmatic breathing. So again, those deep breathing exercises. Happify is an app that does brain training to help combat negativity and manage your stress and anxiety. And then Personal Zen is an app that has games that can help relieve some of that anxiety, and is based on like clinical findings. And then Complete Relaxation and Calm are examples of apps that provide meditation videos or not podcasts, but like meditation, not sounds either. I don't know the right word for it, but it's meditation that you can do like from your phone. And yeah, these are my resources. And I'll provide the PowerPoint to you so that people can see the different apps that they can use.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. Thank you so much. As I had put in the chat, this has been great and comprehensive, so I appreciate it. And if there are any questions or follow-up, make sure you all reach out and we can get you those answers. But this has definitely been very resourceful for individuals who may find themselves in a time of stress, whether grief and loss, life being transitional, whatever it is. So really great resources. And I love how you touched on the different domains of the mind, the body, and the spirit. That was an awesome graph, or I should say an awesome picture that you had. So once again, thank you. And we look forward to next month for